today, which is movement ecology. And for that, we will have the immense pleasure to welcome Emily Shepard from Swansea University to introduce the session in a plenary talk. So Emily is a professor at Swansea University in Wales, and she dedicated her career investigating birds' movement. She specializes in particular in individual-based approaches such as GPS tagging to understand better the energetic costs, environmental drivers, and distribution of bird flights. But first, let's take a step back on her career. Emily studied in Oxford and Plymouth, and after that, she did her PhD in Swansea University, working on the underwater movements of basking sharks and cormorants. This is where she realized how much animal tagging methods could help inform flight behavior, and she decided to pursue this line of research. She really loved Swansea because she decided to stay there for a postdoc, where she studied the flight behavior of Andean condors. She there got interested into the importance of environment in shaping animal decisions, affecting flight cost and even macroecological processes. And she's now still working on these topics as a professor in Swansea. Today, Emily's plenary session will focus on her current work, and I will now step aside and let her talk for this plenary session with a title which is as intriguing as it is exciting. Please fasten your safety belts in preparation for landing.
Bonjour, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome, and particularly thank you for the air conditioning. So, as Leo said, I work on flight, and I'm really interested in how airflow, so wind and turbulence, affects flight costs and flight decisions. But today I'm going to focus on a very specific part of the flight, the landings. And obviously, landings can just last for a fraction of a second or a few seconds, a very small proportion of the overall flight. So I imagine that the vast majority of you might be thinking, how can that possibly have any ecological relevance? But I want to present some studies that we've been working on over the last few years to try and persuade you that it can have ecological relevance. And these landings, these very short-lived behaviors, can actually influence population-level processes. And I guess that we're used to the idea that these fleeting behaviors can influence population-level processes if we take the example of a hunt. So in this example, we've got a predator, a fast-moving predator, and prey. And every twist and turn that that predator makes in the chase, and every twist and turn that the prey makes, can influence the outcome. So these are short-lived events, but we know that they can influence population processes because the young tend not to be so good at them. So young predators tend to not be so good at the hunting, and young other animals tend not to be so good at escaping. So young animals have higher levels of mortality. Of course, that feeds into population growth rates. But as terrestrial animals, I think that sometimes we have a hard time really imagining the reality of these high-performance fleeting behaviors in the aerial environment. So we'll do a quick armchair thought experiment, just taking a very extreme set of comparisons. So imagine if we have to send our young out to learn to forage, and perhaps it might look like this as an extreme example. Perhaps you might say, okay, dear, well, you've got to go and pick some apples today, so good luck. They go out with their basket. They come back at the end of the day and they say, well, how did that go? Okay, well, you didn't get many, but you might do a bit better tomorrow. So, don't lose heart. Keep going, keep going. But for a falcon or an osprey, sending your offspring out to learn to forage looks a bit different. Perhaps it looks a bit more like this. So there's a launch phase, and then these animals have to obviously fly through the air. And the really critical part is the landing, where you've got high ground reaction forces, and you've got to nail it. You've got to nail it to make sure that you're not injuring yourself, but you're directing that ground reaction force at your prey. And it's that which obviously is the difference between being successful or not. So you might ask your young osprey, how did that go? Still alive? Okay, good. Because tomorrow there's a really strong crosswind, so good luck. So flying animals have to contend with different factors, and the landings can be very risky. So that's really where I want to begin the talk today. I'm going to start with a case study about barn owls and want to take a look at landing forces, the ground reaction forces that these animals sustain when they're hunting. And then I'm going to move on to the question of, do landings ever go wrong? Do animals always manage to get it right or not? And if they do go wrong, what makes it more likely that it will go wrong? So we're going to move from controlled landings in the first case to uncontrolled landings. And then finally, we're going to look at this question of whether landings can influence population level processes. So, kicking off with barn owls. This was some work that was done by Kim as part of his PhD in the University of Lausanne. And hats off to Kim, because he basically turned nocturnal for large sections of his PhD and did an immense amount of field work. And he ended up tagging 163 barn owls in 2 seasons with these loggers, and you can see one of them on the back of this bird here. And the loggers were recording GPS location once a second, so got quite high resolution movement tracks. And they also had a triaxial accelerometer on board, which was recording 50 times a second. I know many people are using accelerometers these days, but for those who aren't familiar with them, essentially it captures animal movement. So if you're recording in all 3 dimensions, the dorsoventral, which is the heave acceleration, forward back, the surge acceleration, and side to side, the lateral acceleration, the sway. If you're recording in all of those dimensions, every movement that the animal makes is recorded by the accelerometer. And the accelerometer will produce distinctive movement signatures, which tell you about the behaviors that the animals were performing. And so we'll look at a little bit of that data now. This is the first feeding trip of the night for one of the barn owl adults. This is the nest box, and then the barn owl leaves. And here you can see a couple of orange squares. These are perching events. So we know the animals stop because obviously the speed dropped to 0, but you also get a very distinctive change in acceleration when it suddenly comes to a halt. We'll look at the signature of perching in a minute. Then it continues, and then here we know that the animal had a successful hunting strike. We know that there was a strike because suddenly you get this massive deceleration when the animal comes in and launches an attack on a prey. We know that it was successful because in the acceleration data, you see a movement signature, which tells us very specific to an animal trying to engulf a rodent, which is a large portion of its own body mass. So it kind of starts going, it's trying to get this rodent down. And that's what this looks like. So there's a feeding, a signature which is specific to self-feeding. So once the owl has fed itself, every other hunting strike is dedicated to finding prey that it's going to use to provision its young. So we know that the owl continued, had an unsuccessful strike here. So again, a massive deceleration as it strikes the ground, but without a prey, it continues. You've got a perch and a hunting attempt, and this goes on until finally we have another successful hunting strike. And here we know that this one was successful because the barn owl flew back to its nest, and Kim had a fantastic system where he had cameras set up by the nest boxes so they could see the animals returning with the prey item, identify that prey item, and then it goes in and feeds it to its young. So the acceleration data for perching and strikes looks like this. This is the heave acceleration, so the acceleration in this axis when the animal's flying. Each peak here corresponds to an individual wing beat. So you can see the animal's flapping here, and then there's a short glide before the animal then perches at the end. And you can see that when the animal perches, the amplitude of the acceleration signal is actually really quite low. It's lower than the accelerations that are generated within an individual wing beat. But then contrast that with a hunting strike. Again, we have these individual peaks in the acceleration data, and then kind of a bit of a mess, some more dynamic acceleration before this very big strike at the end. And that's the deceleration as the animal is hitting the prey and the ground. So here we typically measure acceleration units of gravitational acceleration. But we can actually convert this to an estimate of the ground landing force, ground reaction force, because force equals mass times acceleration. Kim knows the body mass of each of the barn owls that he tagged. So he simply timed the body mass by the peak vectorial sum of the raw acceleration. So he's taken the vectorial sum across all three of the acceleration axes and looking at the maximum value that was recorded during a strike. And this is quite fun because then suddenly we can get an estimate of the force in newtons, and we can see that when an animal is coming into perch, it actually does so with a force of about 3 times its own body weight. But in a hunting strike, on average, these animals are generating a ground reaction force over 13 times their body weight. How does that compare with other systems? Well, Steve Portugal did a really nice study with secretary birds. This is Madeline, who was striking a rubber snake somewhere in the south of England. And he measured the ground reaction forces that Madeline generated. And it was about 5 times the bird's body weight. And if we look at the barn owls, it's actually the highest strike forces that have been recorded that we found. And while on average it was 13 times body weight, it went up to a maximum of 34 times body weight. So to kind of to show what that, give a sense of what that might mean, if I times my body weight by 34 and hit the ground really quickly, then I would be striking a prey item with the same force as a white rhino. So they are developing really high ground reaction forces. The peak reaction force is actually likely to be higher because we only recorded acceleration 50 times a second. But in controlled car tests, when they're actually measuring the forces that are developed, they're typically recording 2,000 times a second in order to get the true peak acceleration or deceleration in a crash. So, obviously, this is a very particular behavior when the owl, a predator, is trying to increase its ground reaction force in order to take out the prey. So in this scenario, the yellow car is the prey, unfortunately. But most of the time, when owls are coming into land, they're not trying to maximize or increase their ground reaction force. They're probably trying to minimize it. Because landing in ordinarily, well, again, as I said at the beginning, animals want to minimize the chances that they're going to injure themselves. But there might be other reasons why a really soft landing would be beneficial. So, barn owls are known for their silent flight. We know that they've got spectacular morphological adaptations to reduce the noise as they fly. So this is a feather on the leading edge of the wing, and you can see this comb here, which actually reduces the turbulence as the air moves over the wing and helps them fly very quietly, which is obviously important if they're flying low over the ground and trying to listen out for their prey and remain undetected. But owls hunt from perches as well as on the wing. So they actually have a sit and wait strategy that they use, not much of the time, a bit over 10% of the time. But what this means is that these owls need to fly quietly, but they also need to land quietly. There's no point having really quiet flight if then you're going to crash into your post and announce to all the rodent population that you've arrived. And the landing force is relevant here because the higher the landing force, the higher the noise. So it's another reason why these birds, when they're hunting and using perches, should be landing quietly. So we were interested in what affected the landing force in these birds as they were hunting. So Kim analysed a huge number of perching events and extracted the peak ground reaction force. And what he found was that the force that they landed on their perches varied depending on the type of perch that they were using. So buildings were associated with higher ground reaction forces than trees. And this makes sense because if you imagine landing on a branch, that branch is likely to move a bit. It's a compliant substrate, so it's going to absorb some of the ground reaction force. But that's not the case with buildings, which are very solid. So that might explain the difference that we see between buildings and trees. But It doesn't explain the fact that the ground reaction force on the landing force was greater on trees than it was on poles. So those poles that you see in field margins that farmers drive into the ground, they're not compliant, but they had the lowest they had the lowest landing forces associated with them. We think that what's happening here is that if a bird's coming in to land at a branch, it has to kind of negotiate the other branches on the tree. So its landing options are restricted by the architecture of the tree itself. And this might, whereas if they're coming in to land on a pole, that pole is completely open all around it. It can approach it from any angle. What that means is that actually it can use the wind to help it reduce its ground speed. So it can come and land into wind, which reduces the speed at which it's moving over ground, and that helps it reduce the impact. So here's where it feeds into the ecology. One of the interesting things was that owls vary well, they have distinct preferences about where they land. So if we look at the frequency of use of buildings and trees and poles as landing perches, it varies with the time before the hunt. So a long time before the hunt, they're often landing on buildings. This makes sense. They're breeding in nest boxes on buildings. Then they kind of switch to foraging mode. And then they become much more likely to land on trees and poles. And you might say, okay, well, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with landing, because trees and poles are what you find more of in the foraging grounds. But why would they use poles more than trees? And I think there could be several advantages. So firstly, poles are typically about hip height. They're quite low to the ground. So landing on a pole, the owls are close to their potential prey. They're minimizing the distance, which might enable them to actually really locate the prey with more accuracy. They can hear where the prey are. They've got a shorter distance to travel to that prey. But it goes both ways, right? So if the owl can hear the prey, then the prey can hear the owl. So they've also got to land more quietly on poles in order to remain undetected. So the fact that poles can be approached from any angle, which might enable them to land more softly, that could help provide some form of acoustic camouflage and reduce to approach their prey more quietly. And actually, we do run another model of what predicted hunting success. And the landing force on the perch just before the hunt predicted the hunting success. So for every 1 Newton increase in landing force, there was a 15% decrease in the chance of that hunt would be successful. Other factors will affect the hunt as well, of course, but it's interesting that this came out. So it sort of starts you wondering, okay, so we've got these environmental features which affect the landing force, and that affects the probability of success. So actually, by having lots of poles in the landscape, perhaps that's part of, and perhaps we're influencing the decisions these animals are making about where to hunt and how to use the landscape. And obviously, poles are man-made features. They're something we are putting in. So we could be influencing their movement decisions. And when you look at some barn owl foraging tracks, one of the things that's striking is the amount of time that they make these linear forays around the field margins. So it could be one of the factors that affects that movement strategy. So this is what we've really just been talking about here, how the environment can affect the landing force, and how that might affect the choices that animals make about where to move and their hunting success. But now I want to move on to a different topic, which is how the environment can affect the risks associated with landing. Before I do, I just want to say something about the nature of risk. So as ecologists, I imagine everyone is very familiar with the concept of the landscape of fear. So animals respond to spatial variation in the risk of predation. So they adjust their space use in relation to the landscape of fear. But it's not the only axis of risk, the risk of predation. There is also the risk of accidents. So we can define accidents as errors in movement that lead to instability and temporary loss of control. So a slip. And accidents, you can imagine immediately, actually could interact with the landscape of fear, because if an animal slips at a critical moment, it could increase the chances that it actually gets caught by a predator. And there was a really lovely study, some work done by Rebecca Wheatley, which showed this in these rather cute arboreal mammals, the buff-footed antechinus, that live in Australia. And she had them in the lab, and she presented them with two different types of beams, wide beams and narrow beams. And she presented a stimulus, and she measured the speed at which they escaped from that stimulus, and showed that they could move more rapidly when they were going along wide branches than when they were moving on along narrow branches. But then she also looked at the probability of slipping. And for any given escape speed, you can see that the wide branches have a much lower probability of slipping than the narrow branches. So when these animals were presented with a choice when they could access feeding station at the end of a wide branch or a narrow branch, it's perhaps unsurprising that they chose to use the wide branches, where they can move along them more rapidly and make fewer mistakes, have fewer accidents. In this case, slipping alone is unlikely to result in any substantial injury, but it could really influence the chance that it's caught by a predator. But in flying, if animals make mistakes, there is a good chance that it could end up in injury, even without the influence of a predator. And this is really because the main reason is that flight is fast. Animals, when they're flying, are flying between typically 7 and 20 meters a second. So if you work in kilometers an hour, that's up to 70 kilometers an hour. It's really fast. So if they collide with a solid object, you're going to have high deceleration, high forces, and a high probability that it's going to end badly. It's not just animals. This is relevant for us too. And if you don't like flying, perhaps just look away now. This slide might not be for you. Touchdown, the moment of landing, is also the riskiest part of flying for us. And Boeing did a review of when all the accidents happened in their commercial flights over a 10-year period. And they found that 48% of fatal accidents occur in the final approach and landing. And as I said before, obviously that landing and the final approach is such a tiny proportion of the overall flight that can last for many hours. And yet, it's still responsible for almost half the fatal accidents. It's a period of high workload for the pilots. So people have measured the heart rates of pilots as they're coming into major international airports, and they found that while these pilots seem very cool and calm on the intercom as they're announcing the weather that you're going to experience as you arrive, they can have heart rates of 130 to 150 beats per minute. It's because there's a lot to do, and actually glider pilots can have even higher heart rates, because if they're coming into trouble, if they experience some difficulty, they don't have an engine that can actually power them out of that difficult situation. So that makes sense, that difference that we can see between gliders and powered aircraft. So the reason that it can be stressful, I guess, is that there's a lot to do and a lot at risk. And animals and planes, they both have to reduce their ground speed, the speed at which they're moving over the ground, but they have to maintain their airspeed, the speed at which the air is moving over their wings, because that's what gives them lift and keeps them airborne. So there's a lot, the workload's high. Back to animals. Do they ever get it wrong? This is an example from a royal albatross. They have these cameras monitoring them in New Zealand. This didn't end too badly for the bird. I think it just lost a little bit of self-respect, but it wasn't injured. I'm just going to play it again. I'm going to try and play it again. Oops. And notice this time that the grass here isn't moving. So albatrosses obviously breed in windy places, but on this particular day or this moment, it seems to be quite calm here. So the bird didn't have the wind to fly into to reduce its ground speed on landing, which might have misjudged its landing. Okay, there are actually cases where these birds, botched landings can actually lead to fatalities. So I'm going to talk about a case now that Janine was working on as part of her PhD in Pretoria. Janine is an aeronautical engineer, and she's working down on Marion Island in the sub-Antarctic. And she noticed that along one of the ridges where the grey-headed albatrosses breed, there were carcasses. And it turns out that these birds seem to be having accidents as they're transiting to and from the colony. So not when they're landing, but when they're flying very low to ground to get in and out of their nesting sites. So just to orientate you, there are 8,000 grey-headed albatrosses breeding along this ridge, which is just on the south of Marion Island here. And this orange area is where Janine actually did transects monthly to see if there were any carcasses. So she walked, she did transects, and then she also took the GPS location of where she found carcasses to map them. She made some she was there a long time to watch actually how the birds transited moved along the ridge. She had some cameras up too, and she examined the carcasses for signs of injury. And what she found was that the carcasses had signs of impact. So they often had broken either wings or legs or necks and bills, which suggested that they had crashed. And it happened more often than she was expecting. So she found 383 carcasses over 3.5 years. And one of the surprising things, apart from the number, was that they were adults as well as fledglings. So this isn't a case of inexperience. Even adults are getting this wrong. So a lot of adults. This actually is sort of leads to an important point. So some of them couldn't be aged because they had missing heads. And on this island, they're actually trying to eradicate mice and rats. And it's just an example of how sometimes when accidents happen, bodies get scavenged. So we don't always know when accidents happen because the evidence is gone. So birds are getting it wrong. How often? Well, 383 sounds like a lot, but it's obviously a small proportion. The fledglings represent a reasonably small proportion of the annual production of fledglings from the colony. And an even smaller proportion of the adult population. But albatrosses are long-lived birds with low natural mortality. So even this level of mortality might be important. And actually, it represents 11% of the adult mortality. And that's a lot because the mortality of this species is critically endangered species, and the adult mortality in this population is unnaturally high because the adults are still being caught as bycatch. So for crash landings to represent 11% of the adult mortality, it's a lot. Why are they crashing? Well, we can say something about this. This is the ridge, this grey section here, and the black circles represent the nesting sites. So the bigger the circle, the more birds are nesting there. And this heat map shows you where birds are crashing. So there seems to be a hot spot around here where most of the crashes are occurring. And Janine's observations told her that actually a lot of the crashes that she observed occurred in westerlies, which is the prevailing wind direction, which is kind of curious. But when we look at what's happening in the westerly wind, the air is flowing over this ridge and then curling over the other side of the ridge. And in the area of the hotspot, the flow is particularly variable. So the flow is separating, and it's moving in different directions, and you're going to have a downdraft in this particular area. So the air is moving down. And what are the birds doing? Well, when they're moving to the ocean, which is down here, a lot of them are transiting through this area. So if we take a cross-section through this ridge, this is the ridge here now, and this is the wind moving over the ridge, and actually, so this is the down curl, it's directed downwards, and then actually upwards very close to the ridge. what we think is happening is that birds are flying over this area with very little flight height. They're flying low. And so if they fly through this area and then experience a sudden gust punching them downwards, this could really be problematic for them in maintaining their flight control. It could increase the chances that they crash. So it seems that the airflows can increase the risk of crashes. Which obviously leads to the question, what are these birds doing nesting in an area if these risks seem to be fairly substantial? And we think that really, well, there are trade-offs involved in where birds choose to nest. And if you've got a wind coming over a ridge and flowing down, well, as the chicks on that ridge should be quite sheltered from the prevailing wind. So actually being in the lee of the wind along that ridge could have benefits for the chicks. But it's just that sometimes if you get a downdraft, a gust going down, then it's going to be risky. So it is quite unusual that these animals actually nest on an inland ridge, but it happens in the ridge that Janine was working on, and on a neighbouring island, there's another inland ridge. So it'd be really interesting to know if carcasses are found there. But the other 50% of these animals on Marion Island breed on cliffs that basically empty straight onto the sea. So if they hit a downdraft as they're going out to sea, that's okay. They're going to land on the water. It's extremely unlikely to end up in a fatality. So, is this just an anecdotal example, a kind of quirky situation? I don't think so. We've got some evidence that actually it is relevant in other populations too. So as early as 1964, Cohn recorded that albatross, he was recording albatross fatalities in certain wind conditions, actually in low winds. And I'm now going to just finish with an example from northern gannets and some data that Sarah Wanless collected in her PhD in the 1970s. So, to the northern hemisphere now. Something looks a bit more familiar, perhaps. And this, yes, we're looking at crashes, and also this come back to this question of whether crashes can have population level consequences. This is Ailsa Craig, which is an island off the west coast of Scotland here. And this is Sarah Wanless, who spent a long time working at this very difficult site in her PhD. And she noticed that there were carcasses along the talus slopes at the bottom of the breeding cliffs. So you can actually get a sense of where the gannets are breeding, because then you can see the guano, the white, along these breeding cliffs. So they're breeding all along here. And once a month, she walked these talus slopes during the breeding season for 3 years, and she recorded how many carcasses she found. I should have said, yeah, 300,000 breeding birds, quite a big colony. She collected 367 carcasses, which is basically almost up to one a day in the breeding season. So again, well, I was going to say another case of crashes, but this is the evidence that it's to do with flight control. The most common cause of death was a broken wing or neck, usually accompanied by a severe internal hemorrhaging, sustained either as the bird struck the rock face during its fall or when it hit the bottom. So she could see sometimes these carcasses were quite fresh, no sign that they were skinny or in poor condition for any other reason. So she always thought that some of these birds were crashing. And got an MRes student, Stefan, who's working on these data at the moment. And the wonderful thing that, well, we have access to so many wonderful tools now, but one of them is ERA5, which allows you, it's a reanalysis tool which allows you to go back in time and predict what the wind was several decades ago, using a combination of forecasting models and local observations. So we've got the breeding cliffs here, and we can extract the hourly estimated wind speed and direction in 1974 to 1976. And so Stefan is modeling whether we can predict the mortality rate. And he tested the effect of wind speed, direction, and fog. And fog wasn't important at all. We thought, well, maybe it's a visibility issue. Maybe the birds just can't really see the cliffs and they're crashing into them. But it wasn't important. Neither was wind speed, which was kind of intriguing. I was expecting that to be important. But wind direction was important. And interestingly, I think it's quite unusual. We've got this bimodal wind direction. So winds are basically either northwesterly or southerly. So I should have said, in Stefan's model, he binned winds into these two different categories. And it was the frequency of the northwesterlies that predicted the crash rate. So we've got a proportion of northwesterly winds here. We've got the crash probability here. And you can see that there's a positive relationship. And these dots are coloured by month in the breeding season, and they're also scaled according to the number of birds that were on the island at the time, at that month. So we've got a nice positive relationship. So what is it about northwesterly winds that makes them problematic? We did some airflow modelling over the Elsa Craig to try and understand this a bit more. So if you take a digital elevation model, a DEM, you can use computational fluid dynamics to flow air over that island in a computational environment and predict the strength of the horizontal component and the vertical component and the turbulence, the gustiness around the island. This is us looking down on Elsa. So you can see, this is north. So in southerly winds, the wind is flowing around the island. In a northwesterly, it's hitting this side of the island, and this is where the breeding cliffs are. So this is the island. These black lines, these outlines show you where the birds are breeding. And these are the outputs from the model. I was hoping to step through them, but the animation hasn't worked. So let's just start with this top row. We simulated the horizontal component of the flow for a southerly wind and a northwesterly wind. Blue colours are low wind speeds. So when we look at the horizontal component of the flow, the breeding cliffs, which kind of fringe these areas here and here, they've got a really, really low horizontal component of the wind. It's actually really sheltered in that respect. When we look at the vertical component of the flow, in southerly wind, well, there's really not much of a vertical component. But in northwesterly, suddenly the island lights up. We see lots of red, so they're getting quite strong updrafts. So the wind is hitting the cliffs and it's being deflected upwards. So that horizontal flow is being translated into a vertical flow. But that shouldn't necessarily be problematic for landing gannets. If they're coming in and trying to control the rate at which they're touching down, actually having a vertical flow, an updraft, might help them do that. So I don't think this should be problematic, but I think this is. So when we look at the turbulent kinetic energy, which is a measure of the gustiness that these birds are experiencing close to the cliffs, very low, very little gust, not gusty at all in the southerly wind. But in a northwesterly, we're seeing very turbulent conditions. So you're getting strong vertical flows, the air's going up, but not constantly, it's going up and it's fluctuating. So I think this is what the birds will struggle with potentially when they're coming into land and moving around the breeding cliffs. Do they matter from a demographic perspective? Again, we've got quite a lot of carcasses, but they're just 0.5% of the Elsa population. So Stefan is running a matrix population model to look at this. And he's got very good data on adult and chick survival, which enables him to populate this model and look at the probabilities that individuals transition from chick to fledgling to juveniles to adults, and then the probability that they breed. And this is what he has found. So the wild type, this is when birds are crashing. This is how the population is projected to increase. If we remove the crash mortality, this is how the population is predicted to increase. So over 25 years, if we remove the crashes, the population would be predicted to be 12%, over 12% higher than if they weren't crashing at all. We can also do something else. So we know that northwesterly winds predict the probability that these birds crash. So we can say, okay, let's play with the proportion of northwesterly winds that these animals experience. This is the actual proportion of northwesterlies on average that they experience on average, which is between 40% and 60% of the time. So we kind of expect most population to be increasing in this manner. But if we say, okay, make it all northwesterly, we know that wind direction and wind speeds are changing quite substantially in some part of the world. What would that do to the population growth rate? It makes a really substantial difference. So actually now, over 25 years, there's a almost 11% reduction in the population growth rate. This is extremely unlikely to happen, but it's quite an interesting thought experiment to say how important is wind direction. And likewise, we can make the proportion of northwesterlies 0. So between these two lines, this is the envelope of kind of wind influence on population growth for ELSA. So, to wrap up, I think we often assume that, a flight is incredible, is absolutely incredible, but animals do get it wrong. And one of the tricky conditions that they have to contend with is how to negotiate gusts. So this can result in mortality, and that can be a substantial portion of the natural mortality in long-lived birds that have low natural mortality. So I think the risk of accidents can affect individual behaviour. Got some data on that, and Tristan is doing something on that at the moment. I haven't shown that in this talk. In some places, it can have demographic consequences, potentially. I think it might also affect where different species choose to nest. It's something that we're looking at now, still work in progress. And in a very general sense, we know that, as I just mentioned, wind conditions are changing. So I think understanding how wind impacts these very local processes around the breeding colonies is still, there's a need to understand more. And final thought, it's not a coincidence that the examples that I've shown are seabirds. So this is unlikely to be important for small birds and for passerines, and here's why. When you do your risk assessment, something we all love doing, two things feed into it: the severity of the accident and the probability of accident. Morphology affects both. So collision forces increase with bird mass, as we covered at the beginning. Long wings are also more prone to fracture. So large birds with long wings should be more should experience, the consequences of accidents should be more severe. Morphology is also more important. So going back to the point about engines and powered aircraft versus gliders, larger birds have lower available power, lower capacity to produce really high bursts of high power to get themselves out of difficult situations. And this is what we've talked about today. So seabirds, we have large animals and in an environment, an open environment with strong airflows. So this might interact with the morphology to make them more risk prone. So huge thanks to all my collaborators and co-authors and funders. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Hi, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I wondered if I have two questions actually. I wonder in the corpse that you found were likely due to accident, right? If there is any individual variability in the chains, or like phenotypes, characteristic or things like that, that could partially explain also the risk of accidents. I don't know, but maybe linked to body size, because I saw that there is not is necessarily age related, right? So I don't know any individual characteristic or variability in the chance of having accidents. That the first question, and then I wondered also given the fact that winds, I didn't know that, but seems to change with time also. Have you find any selection or changes of your population based on morphological characteristic to maybe cope with, well, given the high cost for the population, right, of this accident, as you've shown? Is there any, I don't know, signal of short-term adaptation of your population?
Okay, so in the first question, I think it would be quite hard to look at phenotypic differences. But one thing that we do think is that, maybe I don't need to go back. Yeah, this will do. Birds nest in quite different places. So you get very high nests here. And then some of them are nesting quite low down on the cliffs. So I think that the risk might not be evenly distributed between both of those sets, both of those groups. It would be really interesting to know, but very hard to find out. If it were different, you'd need them all ringed. And I think something I've been thinking about as well is that actually, as researchers, when we go to a colony, we're accessing one very particular part of the population, so often those that are nesting at the edge or one location on an island. So it actually is quite hard to really look at how different animals might, vary how they might vary in their landing impact in different areas of the island, because you just can't access most of it. So I think, yes, I think risk will vary, but I think it'll be hard to say how. Second question, is there any evidence that that body type might be varying through time, of body mass, or how that? Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and again, I think sounds like I'm just kind of, is a get out clause, but I think again it'd be quite tricky to look at. But what's interesting, so gannets are increasing their body mass. Obviously, body mass is subject to different constraints, and I'm not sure we know why gannet mass is increasing. It might be in relation to food availability and wind. I mean, all these different things will affect body mass. So landing, it might have an impact on landing. Whether landing is one of the things that influences body mass, I'm not so sure, but it could well have consequences.
And well, on my way up to pass the micro, I also have a small question where we talked about like the landing for the entire hour, and of course the obvious question that comes into my mind is, what about the takeoff? Because it seems to have like all the data necessary to ask the same question with the birds taking off. And
sorry, what about the what?
The takeoff, like the starts of the flight. And I was like, it's, to me, like I don't know much about it, but it would be the same constraint in terms of selection, high risk of mortality due to the wind shape and stuff. So I wonder whether you had any look at that.
Well, we are going to have a talk on takeoff performance later in the session, so stay tuned for that. In terms of landing, though, I think one of the things which makes it particularly high risk is that birds have already got their full flight speeds and they've got to bleed it off. So they've got to reduce their speed. It's the speed that's problematic. At takeoff, you've got to generate the speed, and you're also typically moving away from the solid substrate. So takeoffs could well be risky, but I think the risks will be higher for landing.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting, the data you have with the owl and their behavior of where do they perch. And I have a question about this. So your main assumption about why they use this perch differently, it's because like the landing on the pole might be more silence. And I was wondering how did you verify this difference in the soundscape of the landing in function of the structure? Because I thought also that it could just be related that the pole are closer to more suitable foraging patch for the owl, and that would just explain why they use more pole, because pole are more or closer to attractive food patch.
So it's quite well established, the relationship between impact and sound production. And we did do some experiments with captive animals where it's easier to get the data that supported that. It's interesting that in Switzerland, so in many systems, poles and field margins I think will be likely associated with higher prey availability, because that's where you get lots of rough grass, greater vegetation height, and animals we know also use linear with field margins and things. But interestingly, in Switzerland, it's a little bit different. They are meticulous in their fields and even they mow right up to the poles, so that you don't have that difference in habitat characteristics next to the pole and like some distance into the field that you would typically in many other systems. So I don't think that the acoustic camouflage is necessarily the only reason why they're using poles and field margins, but it might feed into that decision making.
Yeah, maybe like it could be possible to change the structure of the pole in the field and see when they make more sound if actually the horn decide to move to another spot. So you could maybe disentangle actually if it's the pre-availability around the pole or if it's actually like the pole lower sound characteristic.
It'd be a really fun thing to do, make them land more noisily.
Thanks.
Hi. I was thinking about cities that for landing, it's kind of peculiar because the ground is very hard. And I guess the wind is very unpredictable because of buildings and vehicles. And so do you think that this characteristic that may impact landing forces are actually shaping the type of species that do well in cities or the type of species that settled in cities? Did you have some thought of that for not very small birds, but the others at least?
I guess the largest species, some of the species with high body masses would be gulls, and that would be using our cities. I think I'm speculating, but I mean, thinking about, the advantage of buildings, one of them is, you have these very big flat areas, so they don't have to land on a small surface in the same way that some of the cliff nesting species do, and we see that they wind affects the decision of when they land, and they've got a harder job to do. So I don't know if landing would be a particular constraint in cities. I mean, it's definitely different, the type of, like how birds land. And I guess we are putting up cliffs, buildings are cliffs as well as flat spaces. So birds do need to negotiate that. I think it's a really interesting question about how airflows in cities affect flight in a general sense. And obviously we know that with a heat island effect, cities are warm places and they're much more likely to generate probably strong updrafts and predictable updrafts. So that might affect the usage of that city. And there's been some nice work on that by Elspeth Sage and Judy Chamoun-Baranes in the Netherlands. So I think it's how they use the airscape in cities is a nice but quite complicated question potentially, because also you get the wind being funneled between buildings too. So as you say, it's very complex, the flow.
I'm sorry, I only have time for one last quick question that is in front, but then you'll have some time to speak with Emily afterwards.
Okay, first, thanks for the talk. That was really captivating. I had a question. Did you study the risks and forces associated with mid-air high-speed collisions where the predator actually doesn't decrease its speed because the point is to kill on impact, for example?
I haven't, no, but there's been some work done in Oxford on approach trajectories of falcons. So I don't know if they looked at the impact. They certainly looked at how peregrines approach their prey. But yeah, interesting topic for sure.
Thank you so much, Emily. So before we start with the other talks, just a little note on the questions. I think we will stick to one question per person so that the most people can ask questions. And if you have other questions, you can go and see the people after. So the first talk given by an early career researcher for movement ecology is Tom Chauvet, and he will talk about prospecting under pressures, social information gathering strategies in immature gold eagles.
Hi.
Okay, hi everybody. So thanks Emily for this great talk, really interesting. So I'm Tom Chauvet. I'm working here at the CEF. So I'm a second year PhD, and I'm working under the supervision of Aurélien Bénard and Olivier Durier. So during my PhD, I'm working on dispersal. So it can be defined as a one-way movement from a natal site or a breeding site toward a new breeding site. So dispersal exists in all living organisms and has many ecological consequences. In particular, in moving animals, the individuals can choose where to disperse. So they have the choice between different habitats, and the habitat different qualities. So it can depend on the food resources, the competitor density, or the predator density, and so on. So depending on where they will disperse, the individuals will have a different reproductive success. So there is a strong selective pressure in animals for choosing the best breeding sites when they disperse. So for choosing the best breeding site, they first need to assess the quality of the different habitats because they have not prior knowledge about their quality. So they first need to prospect, which means that they visit successively different habitats to assess their quality. And after this, they will be able to choose the best one among those visited. So to assess the quality of the habitat, they can rely on different cues, but it has been shown that they often rely on the conspecific reproductive success, because when the habitat is good, the individuals will have a good reproductive success. So it's a great cues, and that we call the social information. So it has been shown that in birds, for instance, the individuals visit several nests of the other individuals, and they will choose as a function of the quality of the habitat. However, a problem arises when we talk about territorial species, because if they want to assess the reproductive success of the conspecific, they need to intrude inside the territory of the breeders. But the breeders are really aggressive and defend the territory, so it can be really risky. So in this case, the prospector faces a trade-off between avoiding the territory, but they will get no social information, or they intrude inside the territory to get some social information, but they will have to pay the costs, which are stress, injuries, and death in some situations. But the prospecting has been studied in a few number of taxa, mainly in colonial seabirds and passerines. And in those taxa, the territorial fighting are not really violent and not really costly for the prospectors. So in this species, the social information benefits really worthwhile the risk of the territorial aggression. However, in other species, such as territorial mammals, for instance, or territorial raptors, the territorial fighting can be really violent and really costly for the prospectors. But the prospecting has been really scarcely studied in those kind of species. So we still don't know whether the social information gathering is really worthwhile and if the benefit of the social information outweigh the risk of the territorial aggression. So here we ask the question whether the individuals still gather social information in those species despite the high risk of being killed by the breeders, and in what context and for which individual it is truly worthwhile to gather social information in those kind of species. So to answer those questions, we studied the golden eagle here in France. So this is a territorial raptors, whose the individuals have a prospecting period as immature, which can last between 1 and 6 years. And so they will seek for a territory during their phase. And after this, they will form monogamous pair and will reproduce in a single territory for the rest of their life. So the interesting thing in this species is that the breeders have a strong territorial behavior. So the breeders will try to kill all the individuals who intrude inside the territory and who will get close to the nest. So it's really hard to prospect for the individuals. And it has been shown that in some population, it can be the major cause of death, the territorial fighting. So the species is really well monitored in France, especially in the Massif Central population. And 61 individuals were tagged as nestling. And so we have the trajectories of the young eagles during their prospecting phase. And all the pairs are also really well monitored. So we have reported all the breeding events every year. So we have two kinds of data for this study. On the one side, we have the adult nest location here, and we have the prospecting trajectories of the individuals. So thanks to this data, we could investigate whether the immature individual visit the nest of the other individuals or not, despite the high risk to be attacked. So we use two kind of methods to do this. The first one is habitat selection analysis, which consists of comparing the available locations close to the adult nest with the used location, which are the trajectories of the individuals. And we also use recursion analysis, which consists of counting and detecting all the time when the immature individual gets close to the nest of the other individuals. Okay, so now I will present the result we obtained. So here on this graph, on the y-axis, you have the selection ratio. So this is a measurement of the habitat selection. So when is more than 1, it means that there is a selection of the habitats. And when it's below, it means that there is an avoidance. And we calculated this ratio as a function of the distance to a conspecific nest. So here is a result we obtained by fitting a GAM model. So here you can see for long distances, there is a selection of the habitats. For medium distances, you have an avoidance here. And for close distances to nest, you have a selection. So what this means? It means that the immature individuals stay mainly outside and on the edge of the territory of the other individuals. They avoid the core of the territory, which makes a lot of sense because it's the most defended part of the territory. But the most interesting part is close to the nest, where we have a huge selection of the habitats. So it means that the immature individuals stay a lot close to the nest, probably to collect social information by assessing the reproductive success of the individuals, right? So after this, we look at the duration of the nest visiting. So here we have the duration on the y-axis of the nest visiting. And we measure this during the breeding season and outside the breeding season. So we found that during the breeding season, the visits are really shorter than outside. And also, we found that the visits are really shorter in the nests which are currently used by the breeders. So it means that they are probably constrained by the breeder to stay really short, for a short time, close to the nest to prospect. Because the breeders defend really well the nest which are currently using. So it's probably a constraint from the breeders. But they will collect a low quality social information because it's hard to assess the reproductive success of the individuals when there is nothing in the nest, right? So we have also a clear age-related pattern. So here on the y-axis, you have the age of the individuals. And we saw that the duration of the visit increased as the individual aged. So they prospect for more social information as they age. But if we look at the number of different nests visited, we show that they visit less nests when they get older. So they probably focus their prospecting on a fewer number of nests when they get older. Okay, so let's summarize a bit the results. So we found that the immature golden eagles do collect social information because they came really close to the nest, despite it is really risky for them because of the adult risk. So this highlights the critical need for social information for the species, even when it's really risky. We also found that the focus on unused nest and outside breeding season probably as a strategy to avoid the risk of territorial fighting with the breeders, but they collect a low quality social information. And this is interesting because the previous study on colonial seabird showed that the immature individuals come in the high quality nest, high quality social information nest, so during the breeding season, probably because in the colonial seabird there is not such a cost compared to golden eagles. And we found that this clear age-related pattern, which probably show that there is a growing need for social information as they get close to the sexual maturity because they really want to acquire the best territory and to start reproducing. Okay, so we found that there is a link between the territorial behavior of the species and the prospecting strategies. And we know that the prospecting strategy is directly linked to the dispersal dynamics in the population. So probably the territorial behavior affects the population structure through the prospecting mechanism and the dispersal mechanisms. And thanks for listening.
Right. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could see the frequency of the territorial altercations with your sensors for the juvenile.
Yes, that's really interesting. It will be the best way to really assess the cost. But actually, we don't have the precision and the frequency to see this. We have like 5 minutes interval between locations, so I don't think we can see this kind of behavior.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I don't know much about the breeding ecology of golden eagles, but I'm wondering whether individuals that are getting closer to sexual maturity would not be only looking for social information about the territory, but just looking for a mate. I don't know if they are strictly monogamous and maybe they can, I don't know, try to seduce
Yeah,
the
you're
mate.
right. At 5 years old, they are able to breed, even at 4. So it's hard to separate like the really social information gathering to the trying to get the territory and trying to breed with the other individual. Sorry. So yeah, we don't really know. So that's the problem with prospecting. We don't really know what the individuals think when they get close to the nest, and we have not a precision to see what they do. But after the visit, the territory is still occupied by the breeders, so probably they don't reproduce with yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you also looked for other social information condition dependence, such as sex-dependent or personality-dependent use of social information.
You mean like if there is differences in prospecting by sex or like different sex differences?
Oh, yes, or personality-dependent differences, such as boldness or this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So for the sex, yeah, we have big differences, and the female seems to prospect to gather more social information, and so we don't know whether it's because they are more interested in the social information than males, or whether they are less attacked by the breeders than males. So, and we have also different personalities. So some individuals make no visits to adult nests, so they don't prospect actually. And others make a lot of visits every month or every week. So yeah, there is a big personality differences, but we don't know what explains this. And yeah, we have to explore more this kind of pattern.
We have time for one last question.
Thanks. It was very interesting. Yes, I was also wondering about the alternative hypothesis why this bird can go there. But I wanted to ask, is it really good evidence that individuals really use the number of eggs or like reproductive success of other individuals for habitat selection, or is more like an hypothesis?
This has been really well studied in colonial seabird, actually, like in this kind of species. And it has been shown that the immature individuals, like the individuals, really use this kind of cues. So it has been well demonstrated. In our case, we didn't demonstrate it, that we just demonstrated that they come. And we rely on this kind of previous studies to tell that they probably rely on the number of chicks or the number of eggs, stuff like that. But yeah, it's really hard to demonstrate because like we are not in the head of the of the eagles, right?
Okay, so we can now move on to the next talk. Ines Silva is going to present us about this talk entitled "Too Few, Too Many, or Just Right: Optimizing Sample Size in Animal Tracking Projects."
Thank you. So today I'll be talking about part of my postdoc work that is trying to optimize animal tracking projects and specifically looking at study design. So I'll start by highlighting results from a recent meta-analysis by Pergar and colleagues. They looked at essentially meta-analysis of over 10,000 studies in ecological research. And in the best case scenario, they found 82% of our research is going to waste. And obviously, this is for best case scenario, assuming that all underreporting appears in poorly planned studies. In the worst case scenario, we could be looking at 89% research wasted. And essentially, this is looking at, it just cannot fully inform other researchers or policymakers, right? That's the information loss that is happening. And obviously, none of us want our research to go to waste, but there are limitations that are a bit beyond our control, right? And it's sometimes difficult to assess the reliability of our study design, particularly if we're considering, poorly studied species. And in movement ecology, first you have the issue of high cost. I mean, a single GPS unit can be very, very expensive. And obviously, each additional tracked individual is increasing logistical overheads. Another limitation is the 5% rule of thumb. So a device should be less than 5% of the animal's body mass, 3% for flying animals. And obviously, this is an animal welfare guideline. We want to use the lighter, less invasive tags as often as possible. Another limitation as well, particularly with GPS devices, is that there's this trade-off, right, between battery life and resolution. So essentially, as we increase resolution, so the locations are closer in time, it consumes more power, reduces battery life, and essentially is limiting our tracking duration. So sometimes we have to choose between longer deployments or high resolution. Another limitation as well is that you have to consider the behavioral variability within your population, right? So different individuals could have different movement behaviors, they can use space differently, and therefore, if we're not able to capture this individual variation, we could have unreliable estimates. And obviously, we have to consider what scale of the process we are interested in. If we're interested in file scale processes where the metrics like movement speed and distance would be relevant, or if we're more interested in large scale processes like long-term space use requirements like home range area. So essentially in the scientific process, the key point here is the determination of the sampling parameters, right? We are interested in how long should each individual be monitored, how often should locations be collected, and obviously how many individuals should be tracked. Now, ideally, we would all want to track as many animals as possible for as often as possible and as long as possible, and answer all the questions in the world. That would be amazing. But unfortunately, that's not the case, right? We have to kind of choose and maybe favor one over the other in terms of these sampling parameters. So how do we do this? Well, luckily for you, I figured it out for you. I've essentially created a systematic approach similar to power analysis that can essentially determine optimal sampling parameters in animal tracking studies. And it's available as a R-Shiny application. So the way this works is that basically animal movement are realizations of stochastic processes. And this means that behavior can be summarized as these characteristic timescales, the position and the velocity timescales. And it's these timescales that are imposing constraints on our sampling design if we want to have sufficiently large sample sizes to have reliable estimates. So the position of the correlation timescale, so it's better understood, it's essentially the average home range crossing time. So how long does it take the animal to cross the linear extent of its home range? Obviously, as this value increases, the animal is taking longer and longer to do one of those crossing events. So essentially, if we're looking at large-scale processes, right, we are interested in capturing sufficient number of these crossing events. So obviously, sampling duration is the important parameter here. For velocity autocorrelation, this is the directional persistence. If this value is very short, the animal is doing very zigzagging tortuous movements versus more ballistic, like straight-like movement paths if the value is longer. So in this case, if we're interested in fine-scale parameters like speed and distance as our metric, we want a short enough sampling interval that we can essentially get a statistical significant signature of this time scale in our data. So obviously, it's physically impossible for animal movement itself to be uncorrelated. So this raises three key questions. First, can we detect the signature of these timescales in our data? Is the sampling schedule sufficient to get reliable estimates? And is our population sample size sufficient to capture individual variation? So in the application itself, it's very easy. Basically, you upload either your own data set or any data set that you can use to inform the simulations. All the parameter extraction is happening within the app itself. Then we can input device parameters, essentially what design we want to test. In this case, we can look at sampling duration or sampling interval. It does some simulation and model refitting to estimate sample sizes. And then we can look at the estimate bias and confidence intervals. In this case, looking at, for example, home range estimation and or speed and distance estimation, either at the same time or favoring one over the other. I've also recently extended this workflow to add different sources of bias. So you can consider location error, can consider data loss from the fixed success rates differences, device loss to mimic mortality events, and storage limits. And you can also look at either simulating for a set number of tags or also do an iteratively simulation that adds more tags until you reach a specified error threshold. And in this case, you can basically keep doing this workflow, testing different sampling designs, and looking at either individual level or population level inferences, like the mean of a sampled population. So let's assume that you want to track the African buffalo, right? So you're interested in doing a study with the species. In this case, we can find some data sets already available of this species within, for example, MoveBank, and we can extract these measures to inform our simulations. So what I did here is basically I simulated for different sampling durations, starting from 2 months all the way up to 9 years, and for a population sample size from 2 individuals to 50 individuals. So each of those dots is essentially a simulated study. And what I really wanted to focus on here is the fact that no matter how many individuals you track, if your sampling duration is too short, you're always going to have a severe underestimation of the mean home range area. And in that case, you really want to favor longer sampling durations and not necessarily favor higher population sample sizes. So what you can do as well, let's say that we want to look at both mean home range area and mean movement speed at the same time. So in this case, I compared 3 different sampling designs with different sampling durations, sampling intervals, and number of individuals to see which one of these could give me a reliable estimate within this error threshold of 5% for both home range and speed and distance estimation. So we can see that only the 6 years of sampling duration with every 2 hours was sufficient to at least get a good estimate for home range and speed estimation, obviously at the cost of precision, right? Because if we want higher precision, then we want more individuals to actually get a better estimate there. So the practical uses of this, you can use this to justify resource allocation if you're doing funding proposals. You can refine your study design. You can basically get pilot data and see potential adjustments you can make for your particular study design. You can also monitor reliability during data collection, so you can keep testing and seeing when you have sufficient data to actually get these reliable estimates. And obviously, you can evaluate at the end your research outcomes and inform future research that way. So the application and the package is available on CRAN and on GitHub, so feel free to check it out. And thank you for your attention.
So yeah, I have a quick question on how the Earthshiny app works. You said that you have to upload data, like for example, MoveBank, but if you want to study like a study system that has not been studied before and you want to like design to do the study design, how
I didn't cover that, but essentially in the workflow, you can also simulate different parameters. So you can test different things. So instead of using data to inform, you can basically adjust these parameters with some understanding. Obviously, you can use even a different species that could behave similarly enough to at least start with the starting parameters. And then you can use that to get an idea. And obviously then once you start collecting data, you can adjust this, right?
Thank you for your talk. I was thinking about how can you cope with non-stable interval between GPS location through the day?
So that's something that I'm currently working on, and I have already a way to add the regularity of sampling intervals. So essentially, you could have acceleration-based or duty cycling or something that changes the sampling interval along. So I have ways that I'm working on now to also test for irregularity, yes.
You're a very beautiful workflow of things. I have a question on like the practical use of this, in a sense where you have GPS tags on maybe say 10 individuals at the same time, and you want to find if these individuals are sort of like communicating in terms of space use. Let's say for raptor beds, like vultures that probably rely on each other for information sharing and how they change in movement. For example, they usually use wind thermals to just fly around, and suddenly they might change positions. And do you think it's possible maybe to estimate the filter which you can use? Let's say, for example, you have mostly 1 hour of data, right? And you want to find out within that hour if you can actually correlate using maybe this package to see if there's sort of like a link between the communication. It's not really like home range, where you can use like 5-day or 10-day filters whatsoever to estimate the home range. But with communication, it's a bit like short time frames. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can maybe filter to.
So it's more looking, I guess, at the population home range. Like they're because they're sharing information, they're social, and they have it's not just individual home range, right? So that's slightly different than what this is doing, but it's something that I've looked into. So it's something that I can potentially help you with. We can talk more about it, but there's definitely a way to do that as well.
We have time for one additional question. I think another hand was right here. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering whether that autocorrelation parameters are really species specific, like how much variation there is between populations.
Yes, so basically I did some evaluation of, we have access to a global data set of, again, to be fair, mostly mammal species. And I'm trying to expand it towards more species. But we have found that most of these parameters are fairly conservative at the population level, and sometimes at the species level as well. So the good thing about considering the individual variation, because the way the application works is that by feeding it data, you can actually get some population distribution. So it's simulating from the population, not just from the individual level. So it will try to capture that individual variation. And so if you have individuals that obviously are potentially in the extremes of those parameters, it's still accounting for that, which is why also you see in the higher variation of all the outputs from the final example I gave, right? All the simulated studies can be either overestimating or underestimating that. That's coming from the individual variation aspects. Right. Thank you.
So it's time for the last talk before the break. So Steph Trapp will present us about the effects of artificial light at night on nocturnal space use.
Well, hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. I'm Steph, I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Exeter, supervised by Stu Berhop and Zav Harrison. My research focuses on the movement ecology of urban shorebirds, and today I'm going to talk about the effects of artificial light at night on nocturnal space use. So for a bit of background, with growing global populations and expanding urbanization worldwide, the area of the Earth's surface that is artificially lit is estimated to be increasing at about 2.2% per year, and this is predicted to carry on into the future. With this, a whole range of impacts on species biology has been well documented, and these range from phenology through to endocrinology, reproduction and survival, and also impacts on foraging behavior and movement and habitat use. And it's these last two that I'm particularly interested in, so what are going to be the focus of my talk today. So artificial light at night has been shown to present a variety of challenges to movement and foraging behavior. It can completely exclude some species from areas that they would otherwise be foraging in. It can lead to confusion and disorientation and disruption of migration pathways, and it can even be fatal. For example, mass fatalities of nocturnally migrating birds that collide with brightly lit high-rise buildings in the United States every year. But let's not all doom and gloom. There have been some papers that have come out in the past 20 years or so that have suggested something a bit more positive, suggested there might be some benefits to artificial lighting as well. And these are two examples of such papers. These are both on shorebirds, and they both found that these birds actually increase their foraging efficiency under artificial lighting. This has led to some fairly shaky suggestions that artificial light could be used as a tool in the management of habitats for shorebirds. But this does come with a caution. While it looks like a blessing, it looks like a really great benefit, it could also be indicative of some of the challenges of living in an urbanized environment. For example, a degraded habitat because of pollution or because of high levels of disturbance might mean that birds aren't able to meet their nutritional requirements during the day, so are then forced to carry on foraging at night, and this could just be facilitated by that artificial light. So with this in mind, it's really important to understand how species might be responding to these artificial light landscapes, how they might be adapting to them, and how they might even be learning to take advantage of them. And that's going to be key in predicting future impacts. So my study system is Dublin Bay in the Republic of Ireland. It's a UNESCO biosphere reserve, designated partially because of the large numbers of shorebirds that spend every winter there. Of course, in Dublin, you've got the infrastructure of a major capital city directly adjacent to those intertidal habitats that the birds are feeding on and that are protected for them. And this, of course, leads to spillover effects such as artificial lighting. But it doesn't stop there. These birds don't just use the intertidal habitats to feed in. The nature of these habitats means that twice a day, the tide comes in, pushes them off, and they're forced to move up onto terrestrial habitats, like urban green spaces and farmland in and around the city, to carry on foraging. So this brings them even more into direct contact with urban impacts, such as artificial lighting. This is a map of my study area through the lens of artificial light. I got the raster from a satellite image from the Earth Observation Group, which is just showing the artificial radiance coming from the Earth. You can see this very bright splodge down in the left-hand corner. That is Dublin inner city. And then these three estuaries are my study sites. So right up at the top, we've got Rogerstown, which is very rural, surrounded by farmland. And you can see the immediate surroundings of the estuary are very dark. In the middle, we've got Malahide Estuary. That is much more suburban. You can see it's got a variety of farmland and satellite towns around it, and so it has much more variety between bright and dark habitats. And then right down in the south, we've got Baldoyle. This is the most urban of the three. It's very bright across the board. It is actually in Dublin City itself, so it's fairly brightly lit all over. At these three estuaries, I collected GPS tracking data from shorebirds. I put out 195 tags in total across 4 different species, across the 3 estuaries and 2 winter seasons. These are my 4 study species, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to focus on this one, the common redshank or Chevalier gombette. It's a visual forager. I found in previous analyses that it spends a lot of its time during the night foraging on terrestrial habitats, and it has been shown by previous studies to increase its foraging efficiency under artificial lighting. So of my 4 species, this is the one to which the artificial light question is probably the most relevant. So my aim was to understand the extent and drivers of the use of artificial lighting by these birds. And I predicted that darker nights would drive the use of more brightly lit terrestrial habitats. So I was just focusing on the birds that I knew were using terrestrial habitats at night and looking at how they use the artificial lighting within that. So to model this, for each of those 3 study estuaries, for the populations of the birds from each of the 3 estuaries, for every night of the study period, I calculated the mean artificial light level experienced by that population that night. I then modeled that against the mean cloud cover for that night, the moon illumination, and the estuary to allow for those differences in artificial light landscape between the 3 estuaries. And these are my results. They're a little bit complicated to understand, but I'm just going to focus on this middle one to start off with. This is the results for Malahide Estuary. If you remember, that is the suburban one with the biggest variety of bright and dark habitats. So we've got the mean artificial light level on the y-axis, the 4 moon phases on the x, and each of the 3 colors of points is a different level of cloud cover. So looking at this just briefly, you can see the light blue points, that is high cloud cover, and you can see birds are using overall brighter habitats under high cloud cover. The dark blue is low cloud cover, and they're using darker habitats there. There does also seem to be some effect of tide, because the effect of cloud is much more pronounced at the crescent and the gibbous moon compared to the new and the full. So just to try and disentangle this a little bit, I separated the new and the full moon, which caused the big spring high tides. So at the spring high tides, the tides are really, really big. They cover all of the intertidal habitats, and all of the birds are forced up on terrestrial habitats. So I separated that from the crescent and the gibbous moon, which cause the neap tides. And these, unless the tides are much less big, so there's still availability of intertidal habitat at these times. So we know that the birds that are using terrestrial habitats during the neap tides aren't just there because they've been driven there because of the tide. They're there for some other reason and potentially are more specialized to using those habitats. So again, I modeled the mean artificial light level against the mean cloud cover and the catch estuary for those 2, the spring tides and the neap tides separately. And these are my results. So the mean light level is on the y, the cloud cover in octaves from 0 to 8 is on the x, and the 3 lines are the 3 different estuaries. So looking at those 3 estuaries, as you'd predict, the light grey line at the bottom, that's Rogerstown, that's the rural estuary. It's dark across the board, and you can see fairly uniform use of dark habitats by the birds at that estuary. The opposite is true for Baldoyle, that's the urban estuary. It's very brightly lit all the way around, and so you can see uniformly bright habitats used by the birds. But it's at Malahide that we see this really strong effect of cloud cover. Malahide, if you remember, the suburban estuary, the birds have a lot of choice between bright and dark habitats. And here we see a really strong positive effect of cloud cover with brighter habitats used under more cloud cover. If we also have a look at the neap tides compared to the spring tides, so just to remind you, the neap tides are when birds have a choice between using intertidal and terrestrial habitats. So all of these birds in this cohort aren't on terrestrial habitats because they have to be. They've actually chosen to be there. And you can see kind of correspondingly that all of the effects of cloud cover are much stronger in the neap tides compared to the spring tides. So why this really strong effect of cloud cover? Well, not sure, but this is my hypothesis. On cloudy nights, terrestrial habitats are more likely to be a bit warmer, they're going to be wetter, and that brings terrestrial invertebrates like earthworms up to the surface, so they're within easy reach of the birds. In this case, being in a brightly lit habitat is really useful because the prey is there to be seen, and it's going to have the biggest benefit to the bird's foraging efficiency. However, on a clear night, it's going to be colder, it's going to be drier, it's more likely to freeze, This drives earthworms and such further down into the soil, so they're out of reach of birds. And in this case, being in a brightly lit habitat is completely useless for foraging because the prey is not there to be seen. So in this case, it might be that the risks associated with being in a brighter habitat and closer to human habitation might start to outweigh the benefits. So kind of bringing this all together, because the birds that show the strongest response and the strongest variation in use of artificial light at times when they have a choice, so at Malahide Estuary, where they have a choice between bright and dark habitats, and at neap tides, when they have a choice between intertidal and terrestrial habitats, it does look like they're showing some kind of flexible response, and that they are actually actively selecting to use brighter habitats under very specific weather conditions. And I've kind of suggested that this could be because of the behavior of their prey and the corresponding increase in foraging efficiency that they gain from that. So overall, if I'm right about all this, this does indicate that some of these birds at least are gaining some kind of benefit from artificial lighting. And it's probably that flexibility in behavior that is allowing them to make the most of it. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to take questions.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I have a question. Probably I didn't understand properly, but do you have like any comparison with the rural areas or where there is no light at all to see if these parameters are similar?
Unfortunately not. I only had those 3 study areas to work with because of the people who are funding me, unfortunately. There have been some studies from way back in the day, in the 1960s. A guy called John Groscustard, he studied redshanks pretty extensively, and he found that they weren't using terrestrial habitats at all during the night. So they were using them a lot during the day, and they were using them a lot under high cloud cover conditions when all the prey was at the surface. But potentially because it was so dark, because he was in a very rural area, they weren't using those sites during the night. So that's the only comparison I have. It would be cool to have another one more contemporarily, but yeah, that's all I've got to go off.
Thank you for the presentation. I think there is something I did not understand. I'm so sorry about this. I did not understand how you explain that the birds are using a different habitat in function of the population, because for me in the y-axis I was seeing the average light illumination basically, and so I don't understand how you're able to tell if they are foraging in the tidal sea or if they are in land. Because for me, I would expect this result that basically the cloud cover effect is lower when there is a spring tide, when there is a strong effect of the moonlight that can interact with the cloud cover. Because like when there is a strong cloud cover and no moonlight, you might have more reflection from this cloud cover, from the light pollution of the cities, for example, and you can see, I think the best is in the suburban area. So I don't understand how you explain this effect to explain where the birds are foraging.
Yeah, so I might not have explained that y-axis well enough. So that's not just the overall mean light level of the area, that's the mean light level that that particular population of birds is experiencing. So for each night, for each study area, for all of the GPS points from that population, I took a mean of the artificial light, specifically the artificial light of that population. So I understand your point about cloud cover. I also thought that sky glow with the reflectance would be an impact. I've not seen any evidence for that. It does all seem to be just the cloud cover with no interaction with the moon. So the moon had absolutely no effect, which I was really surprised about, but I think it is just the weather conditions, and that is affecting where the population is within their study estuary and what level of artificial light is associated with that. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. I'm just intrigued by that you can see this resolution in the land use just with the light level, basically. But if you say so, then it's a great technique, actually. So cool.
Yeah,
thanks.
So the satellite images, 75-meter resolution. So the squares on the raster that I used are 75 meters. So that did give me enough resolution to see a differentiation between the different sites the birds were using. Yeah.
Thanks.
We have time for a quick last one.
You've mentioned you also studied the 3 other bird species. Do you find comparable patterns, or is it very different for them?
So it did vary quite a lot between species. Back to my study species. Yeah, so of these 4, the oystercatcher and the godwit barely used any terrestrial habitat at night and generally just roosted over the night. I think potentially because they're quite sensitive to disturbance, and so they tuck themselves in really safe areas to roost. The curlew showed something different again. They showed a strong impact of the moon brightness, but they seemed to avoid artificially lit areas. So they were using light, but they only used natural light. I think potentially they're much more sensitive to disturbance, and so they were avoiding brightly lit areas that were closer to human habitation. So yeah, quite a lot of variation between the 4.
So we will now take a 20-minute break and come back after.
Please, we'll start. Please listen. I wait a few seconds for the people to sit down. No pressure. Okay, so our next presentation will be by Roger Lopez Manias, who is a PhD student from the Institut Botanique de Barcelona. And he will present us with this. He will present this talk entitled "A Remote Sensing-Based Toolbox to Disentangle the Ecological Drivers of Insect Migration."
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So we can keep this and we can see this landscape. This is in northwestern Africa in February of this year, where we had the opportunity to sample looking for insect migratory species. You can see here my colleagues, Gerard and Clara, with a nice success, I would say, in diversity and abundance, and also in different life stages of the species that we found. Actually, what we witnessed, I wanted also to show you from above using the satellite image, what the region looked like in February and how it looked like some few months later in June. So no more seasonal vegetation, completely dry, and probably no more phytophagous insects in there. So what we actually witnessed when we were there was the growth of one of the multiple generations involved in long-range migratory insect flights. These insects' life histories have evolved to exploit and to follow the seasonality of their habitats, and thus their movements, their arrival and departure times are linked, and to these environments that are to some extent predictable, or we expect. So we were seeing a repetitive pattern that were of course not the same, not the first people to see that. Early century entomologists already described these movements and pointed at different challenges that they found when they tried to study these systems, mainly the lack of data. So to address these questions that they already have and that nowadays are still the same because of this lack of methods to individually track insect movements, because of their low body mass, but also their massive population numbers and their short lifespan, is not very it's not easy to add a tracker to their body as we can do with birds. And we still have, for most of the species that we know that migrate, the same questions. Where do they migrate to and from? What amount of insect aerial biomass is migrating, and how do they cross the major ecological barriers? Having to rely on indirect methods, I am going to tell you a bit about some of the ones that we use to study these insect species movements. We use the satellite remote sensing, we use spatiotemporal species distribution modeling, we use radar aeroecology, and we use the analysis of the wind trajectories. So starting with the, and of course, we can't forget how I was about to do of fieldwork to test and validate these methods. So starting with satellite remote sensing, it offers us a synoptic coverage of Earth's surface at a high temporal resolution and different spatial resolutions of relevant ecological variables such as temperature, precipitation, or vegetation-related variables such as NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. Using this data and combined with extensive fieldwork datasets, we retrieve the ecological niche for these migratory species, as you can see here in this work for the painted lady butterfly, actually the immature stages. By projecting this niche to interseasonal steps, thanks again to this high temporal resolution, we can observe how the habitat moves first northwards and down and later southwards along the season, and how they have to cross the Saharan Desert, and the Mediterranean Sea. Using these seasonal distribution maps, we can also compare at the phenological stage of the vegetation that the larvae are feeding in. You can see here the seasonal habitat distribution in the background and the vegetation phenological curve in these orange lines. We can see that in the northern part, they feed mainly during the vegetation green up period, so fresh vegetation that they can feed, while in the southern part they have to rely in the early senescence periods, starting from the peak of the season and feeding during these early senescence periods. In the Mediterranean, we see these combined patterns with higher habitat availability during the green up stage of the vegetation. And this is how we study and, well, how we analyze these seasonal patterns and repetitive movements. But we know that most of insect species also have low phylopatry that allows them to exploit seasonal resources at the edge or out of their main migratory ranges and migratory ranges. How this happened also in early 2019 as massive migratory swarms of the painted lady butterfly were reported in the Eastern Mediterranean and later in the continental Europe. We wanted to study the origin of this population outbreak. And to do so, we gathered a long time series of vegetation productivity satellite data, and we estimated the expectable levels of vegetation productivity along the season at a pixel at the pixel level, and then compare these expectable levels to what happened in 2019. As we can see, there was wide areas with a high surplus in vegetation productivity in the Arabian Peninsula that likely hosted this development of this massive population. We published these results together with the analysis of the pollen grains carried by the insects that was pointing more or less at the same locations. And we also launched an Earth Engine app, so you can also explore the vegetation anomalies worldwide, both positive anomalies and negative anomalies, such as droughts, etc. But how does an insect mass migratory movement looks like? Well, these events are very unlikely to be witnessed as they doesn't happen regularly. We have this for the painted lady. We have this for dragonfly, the Emiana xepifigure. And as early century entomologists asked and thought how much we could learn if we were able to monitor these events continuously. To do so, we make use of the ecological radar, that is a tool developed to monitor the aerial biodiversity, very much used in birds research, but with enough resolution to also identify insect targets. So we're using this data to monitor the migratory activity of insects a long time for long periods, and also we can have ancillary information like the flight direction, flight speeds, or flight altitude. We're currently studying the Baltic region in Finland, in Sweden, and in Latvia. And these are the results that we have. We're still analyzing them, but we can see some differential activity patterns between day and night in Finland. We can also see the different activities during the days in PAPE, or we can compare the activity within the three radars. We can also check the direction of the flights, and here in this case I showed you the moment where we have a directional flight pointing either north or south later in the season. To further explain these behaviors, we make use of the wind trajectories. Brief explanation, what we see here is where the wind is blowing from, while what we see up in the insect plots, or in the insect direction plots, is where they are flying to. So here in Finland, we have a good agreement of wind directions and insect directions, similar in Sweden with a bit of north drift compensation. And in PAPE, in this case, we observe active flight against the wind. So interesting patterns too. We also make use of the wind trajectories to study their effect in the major crossings of in the crossing of major ecological barriers by selecting those trajectories arriving in the northern area, in the northern line of the barrier that also cross the southern tip. We can retrieve the areas offering a lower energetic cost when facing these migratory flights. We can also extend this analysis to the evenly distributed points along the northern coast and get the areas offering these more efficient paths to cross the ecological barrier. So if you were an insect about to cross the Mediterranean, these regions would offer better ways probably. Taking all together, we use this toolbox, the satellite remote sensing to track population outbreaks. We use spatiotemporal SDMs to retrieve the ecological niche and to study the phenological linkage with the habitat. We use radar air ecology to monitor aerial insect biodiversity. We use wind trajectories to study the least cost migratory paths and to explain local movements retrieved by radar. And of course, the field work to validate all these methods. With this, I would like to thank my colleagues and collaborators and you for listening. And yeah, if you have some questions.
Thank you for the talk. Are there any questions?
Thank you for the talk. That was very fascinating. I was super impressed by this radar aero ecology. So based on what the radars are based, can you kind of weave together where the mass of insects are moving, or they are basically independent?
Sorry, could you?
Oh yeah,
maybe
maybe the next. Oh,
next one.
no, before. Yeah, there. Okay, so there are 3 radars. I was just wondering how wide their range are. Can you basically track the same movement of insects across those 3 radar points, or are you more interested in just summary of activity that's collected from each?
Yeah, so if I understood well, what the data we have here is independent at every radar, as their range is not connected. So yeah, we are mainly studying, or what we are looking for, as we are still analyzing this data, if we can see any time lags in the flights we observe in the southern regions, maybe earlier in the season, with the ones we observe later at the northern latitudes, and the same on the fall migration pointing to the south.
I also have just a small question on the spatial overlap of the data you're using. So you showed some results and data on the radar from Northern Europe, and then you showed the migratory birds and wind data from the Mediterranean area. So I wonder if you have any what's the spatial coverage of the radar, and whether the analysis you want to run would be intercontinental scale, or you're just going to focus on the northern part of Europe?
Yeah, so ideally we would place radar at every of these dots. But as this is impossible, we are using data that has been already retrieved. So yeah, we're interested in the Baltic region as it is the northernmost distribution for most migratory insect species. But yeah, we are looking for place these machines that are has a higher economic cost at lower latitudes, and yeah, we are very interested in having data from the Mediterranean region. At the borders, we are mainly interested in the borders of the distribution and in the ecological barriers.
Thank you for your talk, Roger. Very interesting. I was wondering, where do you get the wind data? Which was the source of the satellite data, or what was the model that you obtained from?
So yeah, the data we're getting from to retrieve the trajectories, it comes from a high-split model that is an available algorithm, I think is maintained by NASA, which based on specific dates, atmospheric conditions, calculates the path of let's say of a particle that is thrown at a specific location and date, and we get single trajectories for the temporal resolution that we ask for. That is what we can see here. For instance, I think here we set like every hour during the whole migratory path, so from February to late May, and we get one trajectory per hour.
Thank you.
Sorry, no time for other question, but if you have any in mind, don't hesitate to reach to the presenter. Thank you. Yes. So we now welcome Sabia Sheikh. She will present her talk entitled Mapping the Menu, Understanding Seabird-Prey Interaction to Inform Conservation Strategies.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Sabia, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Exeter. And I'm going to present some of my PhD work that focuses on mapping seabird and forage fish interactions to inform conservation strategy. So seabirds are marine top predators. They play an important ecological role in the marine ecosystem as well as the coastal ecosystems they inhabit for breeding season. But globally, half of seabird populations are experiencing declines, which makes them one of the most threatened bird groups. And a recent report in examining the status of European seabirds identified climate and fisheries-induced changes in prey availability as one of the major threats faced by declining seabird populations. Which is why understanding links between seabirds and prey can be key to establishing effective spatial management, which is where I come in, or at least for my study site. So I'll start by briefly introducing my study site, the Isles of Scilly. It's an oceanic archipelago located off the southwest coast of the UK. It supports a rich diversity of marine and terrestrial life, including an internationally important assemblage of 13 seabird species, which makes it one of the most diverse seabird assemblages in all of England. But some of these seabird populations are experiencing declines despite increased onshore conservation efforts, such as rat eradication, designation of an SPA, and then extension of the SPA to protect seabirds at sea. You can see the boundaries of the SPA in this map in red here. And the role and state of prey availability in these population declines remains largely unknown. And to sort of explore whether prey availability plays a role in population declines, we need to better understand the foraging ecology and diet of the seabirds and the sillies. So my PhD is a multi-species project, but today I'm going to focus on one of my species, the European shag. So the shag is a coastal seabird. Their UK populations are currently red listed, and the silly population has declined by 40% in the last decade, which is quite a lot. And we have very limited knowledge of foraging ecology or diet of shags from the sillies. So to understand their foraging ecology and diet, we GPS tagged 26 breeding individuals during breeding season in 2024 and 2025. We taped the tags on using this marine tape called Tessa tape on their lower back feathers that you can see in this photo here. And then the number of days each bird was tracked ranged from 1 to 38 days, and we downloaded this data using either a base station or a mobile phone network. And out of this, we got 346 foraging trips. From this data, from last year's and this year's data, it looks like the shags are foraging largely within the archipelago. And on average, they seem to travel a maximum of 3.5 kilometers away from their nesting site during a foraging trip. In addition to GPS tagging, we also collected diet samples to be able to mechanistically link foraging shags to prey distribution. Out of these 51 samples, 50 were guano samples that are currently being analyzed using DNA metabarcoding, and I unfortunately don't have the results to present here today. But from the one regurgitated sample, we know sand eels are one of the species that shags are currently foraging on. And then now to look at forage fish availability, one of my other colleagues led this work, but we conducted baited remote underwater video system surveys or BRUV surveys. So this is what an assembled BRUV's frame looks like, and essentially it has 2 GoPros attached to it that are calibrated in a way that once we get this data back, we can measure the fish. And as the name suggests, it's a baited camera. So at the end of the pole in the orange can, we put oily fish as bait. And these BRUVs were originally used for ecosystem monitoring. And how they work is we turn the GoPros on, we go to the site where we want to deploy them and then submerge them for an hour and leave them and then come back and collect them again. And then this is what the data looks like. So this is a shoal of sand eels going past. Once we get this data, we then identify all the forage fish species we see, count them, and measure them. And then in addition to BRUV surveys, I've also conducted hydroacoustic surveys and environmental DNA sampling to look at forage fish availability and distribution. But I'm still processing this data, so today I'll focus on the result from the BRUV surveys. So in total, we detected forage fish in 59 locations across the archipelago. We detected 5 species of forage fish, which were lesser sand eel, greater sand eel, sand smelt, Atlantic mackerel, and Atlantic horse mackerel. And we detected them in 2 habitat types, in reefs and sediments. So this map shows you the distribution of where we found the fish and in what habitats. And then max N here represents the maximum number of fish that we saw in one frame. So this is one of the metrics that's commonly calculated with BRUV's data, and it's used as a proxy for relative abundance. So even though it says sand eel here, this is for all 5 forage fish species. I just finished my 2nd field season, so I've done some very preliminary exploration of my data that I'm going to present here. So I extracted all the GPS points from complete foraging trips from European shags from last year and this year, along with the BRUV's data where forage fish were detected. And using their combined extent, I created a grid to look at where the overlap was occurring. And this is a map that I've got now. So the grid cells here are 400 meters by 400 meters, and the reason for choosing this size was because when the BRUVs were deployed for ecosystem monitoring, they were deployed 400 meters apart from each other. And so in this map, you can see the red cells represent grid cells that only had shags or foraging shags present. The blue cells represent grid cells where only bruvs with foraged fish detected were present, but no shags were present. And the purple cells represent the areas of overlap. So I thought I'd do a quick comparison of grid cells where shags and foraged fish were present and grid cells where only foraged fish were present to look at what was going on. So in the areas where shags were present, only 2 species of forage fish were found, which were lesser sand eel and greater sand eel, and that makes sense from the regurgitated sample and knowing that shags do forage on sand eels. And then we detected overlap in both habitat types, reefs and sediments. And the max N ranged from 1 to 400. And then in areas of no overlap, we detected 5 species of forage fish, which was all of the 5 species I listed before, both habitat types, and the max N was same. So obviously this is a very preliminary exploration of the data, and there's loads of next steps. So I'm going to conduct another field season in 2026 to collect data on forage fish availability, seabird foraging, as well as diet again. And then I'll get diet results from all the DNA metabarcoding on the guano samples, which will help me filter out the forage fish species to only include the relevant ones in my analysis. And then the plan is to create a predictive layer of forage fish availability with the filtered fish species using species distribution modeling. And then model the habitat selection of foraging seabirds relative to prey availability and environmental variables. And then this PhD is in collaboration with local land managers. And so we're hoping that this will help us contribute towards a data-driven approach to special protection area management. I'd like to thank my funding source, the Bromley Studentship, and all my project partners, without whose support none of this would have been possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabia. That was really cool to hear about. I was wondering if you know how the foraging ranges of your Scilly's shags compare to other tracked populations of shags elsewhere.
So I've looked at some of the Isle of May population tracking data, and the trip metrics look quite similar. But I haven't really looked into it properly, but at least in the UK, it looks quite similar.
Took a little while, sorry. Thank you for your talk, really nice. Is there any fishing activity in the area, or is it just completely preserved from fishing activities? And if there are some, are the shags interacting with them?
So there's a ban on sand eel fishing, and because the shags are only foraging within the archipelago, fishing activity is very controlled by one of my project partners, actually, the Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authority. So it's not that prevalent, and there seems to be no interaction. I think if there are any anthropogenic threats, it's mainly boating traffic during tourist season, which is also their breeding season. And they seem to be foraging like in the middle of the archipelago where there's a lot of boat traffic to get to the different islands for tourists. Yeah, yeah, so I think when I do the habitat selection models, I'll also include boat traffic to see if that sort of impacts how they choose habitat.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have a curious question about environmental DNA. You talk about it at the beginning. How does it work in water? I just know about freshwater environmental DNA, but in marine water, how is the life experience of the DNA inside the marine water? And do you have like results of this method?
So I don't have results of this data, and all the analysis is mostly coordinated by my colleague. But in the field, I can tell you how we collected it. So we print these 3D printed spheres in which we put medical grade gauze. And then we attach them to the bruvs, and then we submerge them for an hour with bruvs. And the idea is that it'll collect DNA that's shed by forage fish. And you know, the limitation with bruvs is if it doesn't come in front of the camera, we don't detect it. And this is just a way to complement those surveys. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about the details of how long it lasts and how the analysis works.
Thank you.
So we now welcome Titouan Homo with his talk entitled Modeling Effective Connectivity to Investigate the Environmental Determinants of Alpine Ibex Migration.
So, hello everyone. I'm very grateful to be here to present you my work that I did during my master thesis at the French Office for Biodiversity. So to begin with a little bit of context, as you may know, habitat fragmentation is one of the main drivers of the current biodiversity crisis. And at the same time, we observe a global reduction in animal movements, which are a pivotal component of their fitness. So this raises the fundamental question of how does fragmentation affect this displacement? And this leads us to connectivity science. So connectivity can be understood through different definitions, but for the rest of these talks, I propose to consider it as the degree to which a landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of organisms. So historically, connectivity has been assessed through its structural components, which is basically looking at how the spatial arrangement of landscape feature affect the displacement of species. However, the problem with this approach is that it overlooks the fact that different species will respond differently to the same physical structure of the landscape. And this leads us to functional connectivity that integrate a species-specific landscape resistance. And nowadays, thanks to the advance in tracking technology and movement ecology, we can explicitly integrate the movement of organisms into these resistance assessments. But we can go even further by considering how the movement contributes to a specific ecological process. So, for example, for gene flow to be effective, the movement of the organism must be followed by the successful reproduction of this individual. And it's exactly the same for seasonal migration in the sense that to be effective, seasonal migration must be followed by the successful settlement of the migrating individual in its seasonal range. And this leads us to the concept of effective connectivity. So effective connectivity for seasonal migration is very interesting to study in alpine ecosystems for two reasons. The first one is that alpine ecosystems experience a very high fragmentation that results from the combined effect of topography and the anthropization of deep valleys. And on top of that, the climate change is acting as an exacerbating force over this fragmentation. And the second reason is that these alpine environments experience very strong seasonal variation in their abiotic condition, which makes the movements between seasonal habitat a key component of alpine species fitness. So now we come to my biological model, the alpine ibex, which is an emblematic alpine species that plays a key role in these ecosystems. And it is not very known, but this species perform seasonal migration to enhance their access to forage and escape harsh climatic conditions. So then my question during my study was, what are the environmental factors that influence this migratory connectivity for the ibex in the effective connectivity framework? So to answer this question, I had the chance to benefit from an exceptional dataset from the Euro-IBEX initiative, which comprised more than 17 populations monitored across the entire Alpine range. So this is very interesting in the sense that we get a view of all the environments that the species experience. So now I'm going to present a little bit my methodological workflow. So there are some parts that I will not detail, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me after. So first, I assessed habitat suitability for source and target habitats. So for example, for spring migration, the source habitat will be winter home range and target will be summer home range. And then in the second time, I benefited from a wonderful analysis from Victor Chauveau, a former PhD student, who assessed the permeability of the landscape to migratory movements. So at this point, we already have some insights about the components that drives migratory connectivity, but this is limited to the very fine scale of movement steps. So I combine these two information into a connectivity algorithm, which is called the randomized shortest path, in order to have a connectivity metric. So this connectivity metric is understood as the expected number of paths that will go through a specific cell of the landscape. But for this connectivity metric to be effective connectivity, I had to weight it with both the source and target qualities of habitat, and also with the intrinsic movement abilities of the species, which can be understood as how likely are the animals to move a certain ecological distance. And from this effective connectivity metric, which is continuous, I was able to define potential migratory routes by binarizing this value. However, I was not able to decide on an unequivocal threshold. This is why I tested three different values for a sensitivity analysis. And now we come to the final step, which was to compare these potential migratory routes both inside the distribution of the species and in its periphery. So to do so, I labeled each pixel of these migratory routes as used or unused, depending on if they fell or not within the distribution range of the species. So from that, I was able to define a binomial variable that I modeled with a GLM that took as input first the connectivity. So this is to verify the hypothesis that the higher the connectivity, the higher the probability of use. I also included 4 predictors. The first one was a human footprint index, which is a highly multidimensional measure of the human impact on the landscape. And also I tested the proximity to ski infrastructures, the proximity to valley bottoms, and of glaciers, and all of which were expected to have a negative impact on this probability of use. So here are the results. So first of all, it's reassuring. The higher the connectivity, the higher the probability of use. So it seems that the model are working. And secondly, which is very interesting for me, is that the human footprint had a consistent and strong and negative impact on the probability of using these potential migratory routes. Also found an effect rather negative of the presence of glaciers, and the other effects I'm not going to detail here, but we can discuss after. So these main results were this anthropogenic influence, which is corroborating the existing studies. And for example, this meta-analysis from Tucker and collaborators who found a negative relationship between long-distance movements and the human footprint index. So this obviously calls for mitigation actions, but to do so, a finer understanding of which components of the human footprint index really impact this use of potential migratory routes. So I would also want to emphasize that the study was also the occasion to provide valuable tools for the ibex conservation that will be beneficial for future feasibility analysis of the conservation actions such as translocation. And to finish, I would like to open on the potential of integrating multiple species in the effective connectivity framework, in the sense that it will provide a more comprehensive view of how the movements, the impediments of the movement of species will have consequences on the functioning of ecosystem. So this is all for me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I had two questions, actually. The first one was about the topography. When did you, in which step did you integrate the topography? Is it like during the SEM model? And the second question was the understanding of the random path you used. Why did you didn't use the least cost path, for example? What's the difference?
Okay, so for the first question, basically the topography, I included it in both the resource selection function with the proximity to valley bottom and to crest. And it's also integrated in the step 2 and also in the final step with the presence of valley bottoms. And then for the second question, I use this randomized shortest path algorithm. So yeah, basically there are two classic ways of modeling connectivity. So the least cost path approach and the random walk approach, which is based on current model. But both of these models have unrealistic assumption in the sense that least cost path assumes that the individual will move optimally in the landscape, whereas the random walk assumes completely random movement. And the thing with this randomized shortest path algorithm is that it interpolates with the theta parameter, which is calibrated with the data between those two extremes.
Okay, thank you.
I saw this small question on the application of the model work. First, thank you for the very nice presentation. And I was like, one of the components, parameter of the whole framework was seasonality and yeah, like the harsh wintering condition. So I was wondering, is it an option also like an application to apply and like consider climate change and the reducing like in seasonality and the opening of habitat during winter? That would be also an option for to applicate and see how like the connectivity is going to change according to climate change actually.
So yes, this will be most likely one of the next questions. So yeah, there are contrasting effects because we also found a strong negative effect, for example, of the forest cover. And so the forest cover is expected to rise with climate change that will increase the fragmentation of habitat. And at the same time, we found this negative effect of glaciers. So that could improve the connectivity. So yeah, there must be future study in order to assess this.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you
So yes, obviously there are some differences between sexes, especially for habitat selection. For example, the females will more select for a stronger slope in order to limit the predation risk. So yeah, and also obviously with the individual variation, even within the same sex, there could be some variation. I could not include it here because of the computation time and everything, but it would be very interesting to look at it, yes.
Okay, so it is now time to welcome Cecilia Jimeno Castellano, and she will talk about vultures, and her talk is entitled Dispersal on Islands, the Case of a Long-Lived Territorial Vulture.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start making a reminder of what is dispersal. In a simple way, dispersal is the movement of animals across the space, trying to find a suitable place to breed in. The first dispersal event in the life of animals is called natal dispersal, and it starts when an animal leaves their natal site and finishes when it settles somewhere to start to breed for the first time, so to try to breed for the first time. Most of the animals have an active dispersal. That means that they select the moment and the place they will start to breed. In the nature, we can find a lot of variability inside of the between individuals of the same species and in the same population. For example, they can decide to recruit or to start to breed as soon as possible to maximize the number of breeding attempts during the lifetime. And they can also wait to breed to enhance the probabilities of breeding success in each attempt because they have more experience or they can reach better vacancies. From a spatial perspective, they can decide to recruit closer to the natal place to benefit from familiarity with the environment, or to go away, to go further and looking for better conditions or less competition, and so on. Individuals theoretically will decide, will select the dispersal strategy that will maximize the fitness prospects. The fitness prospects, and they will decide based on their own role in their context. That means that they decide according their phenotype, the internal state, and the environmental quality and the social context of the natal place and the context they experience during dispersal. Okay. I don't have time for this slide, sorry. In this study, we have focused on the natal dispersal of the Egyptian vulture. That is a long-lived vulture with a delayed maturity. This means they spend many years dispersing, and they have a monogamous and territorial mating system with a high fidelity to the nesting site. This means that the selection of a good dispersal decision will have a great impact in the fitness of these individuals. Egyptian vultures have populations, have continental population, but also island population. Continental population tend to be migratory, but on islands they are mostly sedentary. This is the case of our study system. We study the Egyptian vulture of Canary Islands. It's a sedentary population and is also quite isolated because they barely receive immigrants from other populations. In the past, this population was spread and abundant across the whole archipelago, but since 50s, the population started to decline so sharply and get almost extinct. By 1998, only a few individuals, a few breeding pairs, and the last individuals remain in these two islands, Fuerteventura and Lanzarote. In 1998, a conservation project associated with monitoring started, and the population has been recovering until now. Okay. So the question we want to solve in this study is to describe the dispersal patterns, focus on the spatial aspect. That means we measure the dispersal distance. The dispersal distance is the distance between the natal nest and the recruitment nest. And we want to guess what drivers are determining these dispersal patterns. Okay. Here there is a large set of potential drivers that we have taken into account. To do it, we have data from this long-term monitoring that started in 1998 and continue until now. We have used information about 232 individuals that have been ringed as nestling in the nest, and they have recruited before 2024. And we have measured the dispersal distance. Okay. the results. Okay. This is the pattern of the dispersal distance from canary individuals. We can see it's quite similar to the pattern found by Serrano and colleagues in the Iberian Peninsula. The most selected strategy is to recruit closer to the natal place, so to be philopatric. This is not surprising because territorial raptors usually have this kind of pattern. But we can see a difference between the continental individuals and the island individuals. It's the scale. You can see here they can disperse more than 700 kilometers, and in the islands the longest dispersal is 120. We can say that dispersal on island is reduced, but it's not reduced, it's also restricted to the islands that are currently inhabited. As you can see here, this is the number of territories in 2023, and we can see that most of the breeding territories are still here in this island. Even they can cross between the two islands. So we are seeing here that the philopatry is making the natural recolonization more slow. But we can also see a kind of effect of the conspecific attraction because they are concentrating in some points instead of a spread to empty places that can benefit the fitness. Vale. No, okay. Here in the pattern, we can also see there are differences between sexes, with males being more philopatric than females that have more variability. This can be explained by the territory, by the role of each sex during territory acquisition. Males is supposed to acquire the territory first. They have to fight and defend an area. And females select males or select good quality territories that are already occupied by males. No? So we expect that the drivers, that the selective pressures will be different for each sex. And we can see some support of this idea here. For males, we have found that the drivers that have an impact on the dispersal distance are related to their population density, but also on their own role in the population. Birth years is a proxy of population density. If they have born earlier, they experience an environment with less competitors. And if they born later, as the population have grown, they have a higher population density. And we have seen, surprising, that males are more philopatric when the population density is higher. We didn't expect that. We expect the opposite because we expect the competition for them will be more, they were more sensitive to competition. But we also see that they show advantage to be dominant. Individuals that recruit early and they are dominant can recruit closer to the natal place. So sorry. So to be dominant in this environment could be advantageous, of course. For females, we see that they are less philopatric and they are more sensitive to territory quality drivers. But they also are sensitive to the population density because so in this graphic, we can see the influence of the distance to the predicted feeding points, so the resource availability, and how the effect of this variable have been changed with the population density. At the beginning of the monitoring, when the population density was low, individuals born, so females select places close to predictable feeding points. But as population has grown, this effect is losing. That can make us think they are more sensitive to the saturation of the habitat than males. So males react differently to females. That's it.
Cecilia, questions?
Thanks for the talk. I have a question. Do you think there's like a threshold of population density before they start moving and colonizing the other islands where they were present like in 98 before, or you haven't seen any movements over there yet?
Sorry. The movement of individuals to the other island have been progressive. Actually, I don't have the maps. But here, in the center of the island, there are located the most of the territories. And the growing has been really, really slow to the southern part and the northern part to the island and to the other island. So we think there is a specific attraction that they prefer to recruit closer to the other territories, and this is making the recovery of the population harder because they are not going to go to recruit in empty areas. That could be more beneficial for them because they are not competitors, but they prefer to recruit closer to others.
It's very interesting. I think I lost it. Like, but why did they disappear from the idea island in the first place?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So why we don't have these birds on the other island anymore?
See, that's a little bit complicated to explain. That's why I didn't put it on the presentation. But we think they can reach morphological. We think it's a behavioral adaptation to island conditions. Actually, not the current island conditions, the original ones. Birds, island birds, usually have dense population, and if all the islands have a dense population, it's not worthy to disperse to other islands because you're gonna have you're gonna find a higher levels of competition too. So they evolved to have a really reduced dispersal and to disperse inside of their own island, and investing more maybe on dominance, on competition, instead of dispersal. In this case, they don't seem to have any morphological adaptation that impede them to go to the other island. It seems something's behavioral. They don't have the propensity to go there. We have not seen any individual trying to, performing exploratory movements in the other islands. We have many individuals tagged with GPS, and it seems like they don't want to go there, basically.
Okay, thanks. But you think that if they would like to go, or if they manage at certain point, there is the right ecological condition for them to actually successfully breeding in the island?
I don't think so. Maybe not in the bigger islands.
Time for one last question.
One. I didn't finish, but I can reply you later.
Oh, that's okay.
Sorry. No, in the bigger islands. And I think the presence of conspecifics is very important for this species. So I don't think that if they reach there, they're gonna settle there. And the conditions are not good because these two main islands that are the closest ones, are highly transformed. They have a lot of risk there of human building and human activities. So I think they will.
Thank you for the presentation. So you make the assumption that if they disperse under lower density, environment, check in your data set if their body mass were changing in function of the density where they were dispersing, or if the body mass of their nestling were changing in function of the density to check this assumption?
We take in account the body condition as a potential driver of dispersal, but we don't find any effects. Is that your question, or is the opposite?
To check the assumption that it's beneficial to disperse in a place where there is lower density. That's what you were.
Yes.
That they should, in theory, go to this island where there is less, or in areas that have less individuals. Check actually if there's any benefit to go to this low density area.
Again, no in my data, but previous studies have checked this experimentally. They have translocated some individuals to empty island, and they have find that they have higher productivity. So I have a higher number of chicks. So we assume that in an environment, an appropriate environment with less competitors, will be beneficial to recruit there. So.
It's now time for the last talk of the morning and of the day. So it will be held by Kyumin Ha. Sorry if I misspelled. And I will let you present the title because it has changed.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Kyumin. I'm based in Oxford now, and I apologize for the change of the title. The title that's in the program detail is actually the title of my entire thesis, and I came to terms that it might be more realistic to focus on the variability part of it. But I have some results from my very exciting chapter that I have just analyzed, so hope you forgive me. So today I'm talking about trade-off and social transmission in escape flights. And I want to begin this talk by saying that flight performance is essential for foraging and predator escape, and especially for small birds, because they actually have to escape. But moreover, small birds, especially the birds under 20 grams, they are very maneuverable, they are agile, and very adaptive among the bird families. So it would be quite useful to know how they execute this flight performance in the natural environment where it matters. So I will show you blue tit, which is, I know, which is my study species. It is very small. It's about 8 to 11 grams at most. And these birds are very quick, as you can see here. You can see it's very nimble, looking around all directions, and use flight as the primary source for predator escape, as you can just see there. So I wanted to see and study the natural flight performance of small birds. And to do that, you have 3 requirements. First of all, you need small resident bird population, which is blue tit. And then you need repeated flight recordings of same individuals. This is to be able to characterize the very varying flight performance of small birds. And just as a small leak, flight performance is repeatable within individuals. So it was important to characterize them and control for their individual variation to study them. And lastly, they have to be in natural environment, enjoy my trees. And because that's where flight performance really matters. They forage in the field and they escape predators in the field, which involves a predator. Now, in the methods, how I was able to fulfill all these requirements, I put the smallest sensor that is possible to put on small birds. The high resolution sensors such as accelerometers and magnetometers and high resolution GPS tags that you've seen in previous talks, I haven't asked them yet, but they are likely as heavy, at least as heavy as small birds. So the only tag that I put on this bird is radio tag. It's called radio frequency identification technology. So there's our passive transponder tags that can allow me to track individuals when they are around antenna frequency. And then I was able to get 30,000 flight recordings of 70 individuals of were actually blue tits and gray tits in the field.
using this toner that I built. So this is a toner. It's made out of acrylics. It was really fun to design. And I basically had infrared sensors on the top and bottom. So the receivers and emitters make a beam. And whenever the birds come to the feeder and take off, they break these rows of infrared beams. And by knowing the time they broke the beams and then beams got restored, I can calculate acceleration and velocities. In addition to this, I had force sensor perch so that when the bird landed on the perch, I could get their body weight and their ground reaction force when they're taking off of the toner. And conveniently, I also placed RFID antenna right below the perch so I could know what identity of the bird was there when they were perching and eating the food. And this force sensor was tri-axial force sensor. So that means I could get body weight, but I could also get the maximum resultant force. And I could also get the vertical force and horizontal force that happened during that maximum resultant force. Okay, the third was natural environment. So this entire setup was out in the field. It was in the shed and it was open, except by the mesh that was 3 by 3 centimeters. I put this up because I ran my first field season and there were entire squirrel situation that came and nibbled everything. So this was essential to allow just the small birds to come into the shed and out of the shed. And I also had cameras that are facing to the feeder, thanks to my collaboration with Alex Chan and Dr. Michael Cimento from University of Constance, so that I can fully have the full data of how birds are moving inside the toner feeder. Right, and the second part of natural environment that I really wanted to add to my experiment was predator simulation. So I had this 1 second video of goshawk coming towards the feeder. If you remember, there was a screen behind the transparent feeder. So usually it will just stop at the default view. This is the first frame of the video. So birds enjoy nice greenery. And if I wanted to scare a specific bird at its RFID, I played the video and they saw a predator out of nowhere. So now I have all this data to quantify and study natural flight performance of small birds in the field. And I have 2 main questions. First of all, I wanted to see if escape takeoff differ from normal takeoff with an individual. Because if birds are really using flight performance very relevant to their ecology, they should have different modes of flight depending on if they're seeing food or predator. And secondly, if they do have different modes of flight depending on the stimulus, I wanted to see if flight performance can reflect this socially transmitted predator experience. Basically, because blue tits are very social birds, I wanted to see if the birds that had not seen the predator might also show the response of alertness or predator escape response in their normal escapes or in their normal takeoffs. To answer these questions, I had this logic. So I had 12 experimental days over 3 months just last winter, and I had about 6,000 flights from about 30 individuals. Every experimental day, all the birds that are visiting the feeder had 50% chance of seeing the goshawk display. And if the bird saw the hawk, they were assigned the chipmunk group, and for every next visit that bird was coming to the feeder, it had another 50% chance of goshawk display. And if the bird did not see the hawk for its first visit, then it was assigned to control group, and therefore just enjoyed free food with greenery. So this is how it looks like when the bird gets scared. I slowed it down when it's getting scared. It considers for like half second and then flies away. So yeah, it was very effective, which I was very happy about. And this is the control scene. You can see the sensor breaking, infrared sensor breaking on the right panel. And I could manually trigger the video whenever there is a bird to scare. I basically did what the code was telling me to do. And these are the results. So I use robust linear mixed model, and I controlled for individual by putting individual as random effects. And then I also had day since variable, and this was to compare the experimental day with the day before and the day after. And now we are seeing the results for within individual flights, comparing between normal flights and escape flights. My prediction was they'll be flying where they would have more ground reaction force when they're escaping, but surprisingly, the spontaneous takeoff showed higher maximum resultant force, vertical force and horizontal force. And the only difference, only thing that was quite aligned with prediction was the acceleration one, which is the first in-flight acceleration you can see in the tunnel. Or the errors was non-significant, but that happens. And my second result was within group and then between group. The stars are the significance within group, within control group and treatment group, and the lines are between group interaction effect significance. So although it looks complicated, you can basically see, just follow the control group, which is blue. Although it hadn't seen the predator, you can see it's showing some difference in the ground reaction force, both in maximum resultant, vertical, and horizontal, although it's responding less strongly. So this shows that indirect experience still have some effect on flight performance, but in lesser degree. Conclusion, so escape takeoff was surprisingly lower in body weight and leg forces, except the in-flight acceleration. And there's some evidence that you can see that control birds also showed higher body weight and some leg forces on the experimented day, although it had not seen the predator, as you can see here. Conclusion, escape takeoff was surprisingly less in peak leg force compared to normal takeoff. I think there might be a trade-off with maneuverability and speed. So ideally, if you're escaping predator, you want to be both fast and unpredictable. So I am thinking maybe maneuverability during escape takeoff might have compromised the peak leg force. Secondly, control birds showed higher leg force on the experimental day, but responded less strongly than treatment birds. And this might be attributable to social transmission of predator events, but also that the strength of indirect experience is still less than direct experience. Next steps, I have calculated some network weights. I basically want to see if control birds who are friends with treatment birds responded more strongly. So that'll be the next step. And I also have all these cameras that I have to go through running in deep learning algorithms to get the attention and posture before and after the predator attack. Thank you for listening. And this is my favorite zebra finch, my lab colleague, Emma Borgia, and my collaborators, and my supervisor, Graham, represented by his whiteboard while we are talking about this project, and Blue Tits. Thank you for listening.
Hi, thank you. Can you help me understand a bit more the concept of social transmission and how this social transmission of predators works exactly?
So you can calculate network weights by counting how many times bird A and B were together at the feeder. So they probably have 2 or 3 seconds difference by the time they visited the feeder. And you can count that against how many times the birds spend time with other birds overall. And by using that network weight, you can see if, the birds that were more closely connected to the birds that saw the predator did show the stronger response.
Okay, so the information that would be transmitted from one bird to the other, what that information would be?
Oh, that'll be seeing the predator.
So it's not like the flight mode or anything, it's more like if they tell each other if they saw a predator.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm impressed by the experimental design. That's really amazing. And I'm not used to the literature on not personality, but you have some component of it because I was thinking about the little entrance to go in your device, and I thought that maybe that's a classical question, right? But I guess you could have something with the braveness of the birds entering in your device, and I don't know if it's something that could be important for your results, or you know what I mean. Like it could bias the bird in terms of whose bird, I don't know, personality of the birds or thing like that. Maybe that the bravest bird that goes into the things. No, your device. Am I clear? Maybe I'm not clear. And in which way could, I don't know, impact the results or the central transmission also, or all these things?
Okay,
Is
yeah.
that something
Yeah,
that could
there
be
is,
important?
let me try to.
Sorry for that.
I think you are asking if the experimenter itself might be introducing some bias in the population set.
Yeah, the way they, the little entrance that you show at the beginning that was made for only attract little bird, not attract, right? But with only little bird that could enter into it. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes.
Because I guess I guess it could be even for blue tits, it could be a bit frightening, this little entrance when you can't see any. Maybe we can discuss this after. Too long as it
yes. But this 3 centimeter, 3 by 3 centimeter mesh. If there is the bias, I'll feel like this population of small birds that I'm dealing with are familiar to it, because there are other type of feeders in the woods, and they just cannot be left on their own because there are so many squirrels. They just go and destroy everything. So any feeder they were in the woods that is not this feeder, much more simplified feeder, they're always in this kind of cage with meshes. So I would think they are quite familiar with the mesh system. But I do agree there's a bias in the system that only the birds that are bored enough to come into the feeder will get recorded. So yeah, there is a bias in that. But let's talk.
Yeah, okay. Sorry for the complicated question.
Thanks for the presentation. So actually, I'm more a bit intrigued by the experimental setup. So if I understood, you have the screen displaying nothing to the bird, or either you have like the predator passing by. So I was wondering, how do you know it's related of the fact that the bird perceives it's the predator, and it's not just because something is passing on the screen?
There's nothing passing in the screen but the predator.
No, but that's the thing, like there is something moving on the screen, and how do you know it's like because something is moving or because it's a predator moving?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, it might be just, they're just moving because there's something moving towards it. But there was a study that has been done before that says that birds can actually distinguish if the plastic bottle is coming at them or a predator-looking motor is coming at them. And because I used a predator, I assumed it would be predator. The part B of this study would have been using different videos, such as where there's a goshawk here, but I was also thinking of using pigeons to see if they also take off in different ways when there's a pigeon flying at them. So that study, if I do it, would be the best, would be the most certain way to say, yeah, this was a predator. But yeah, this setup was an inference. It's a natural predator in the environment, so it might be the best way to approximate the predation event.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it is the end of the presentations for today, but not the end of the day, if you see what I mean. So I will do it chronologically.